Chapter 3, 1970 to 1989. Mam. Now I'll move on to when the children were all a bit older. Carol went to Bach, Paul was in Penlan and Michael was in Gendros, so I had a child in each of the schools around here. Paul went to Penlan school when he was 11, and I think that was his downfall because he was terrible when he went there. Carol went to Bach at the same age. Then there was Michael. Because he was the youngest, they used to say he was ruined, but it wasn't that. It was that Paul had no interest in sport, he couldn't be bothered with anything, and all Carol could think of was playing with Janet Dennis and Julie Gregory, her two best friends. Of course, Janet's Grant Blood Dennis, Auntie Blood, used to live next door to us, so more often than not, Jan was in here. I looked after her for a long time. She was like a second daughter to us, and still is, really. Paul was good in school at Gendros before he went to Penlan, but when he got there, he was forever mitching. That school had a terrible reputation at the time. Paul and his mates had no interest. We had a letter once saying he hadn't attended school for 6 weeks. When we went to find out what happened, Paul had been down a bakery going out delivering with the man, but he was sleeping all the time. The man was glad when Dad caught hold of him and made him come home. When he did go to school, he had to have a paper signed in every class to show that he'd actually been there. One day, they were all playing over the fields in what we called Di Augie's farm, when Michael Fussell came rushing into the house calling for us to go over the field quickly because Michael was choking. He had slipped and caught himself by the throat in the fork of a branch, and some of the boys were holding his legs and trying to push him back up. There was another occasion when a horse kicked him in the side of the head and knocked him out. Paul and Carol were there, and after Mike woke up, they picked him up and told him to go home and tell Mam. He stumbled his way back to the house, and we took him to the doctor's. The horse kicked him near his temple, but he was okay. He must have had a thick head, as it didn't seem to affect him at all after. Another time they were all out the field at the back of the house playing when Carol came in to say that Paul was throwing a spear at the kids. I went out and told them to calm down as they might frighten Auntie Blood. She used to think the worst if the kids got too noisy. I only came in and sat down when they were off screaming and shouting again. As I got to the kitchen, Carol was at the back door covered in blood. Paul had managed to throw his spear into the top of her head. At the hospital they cut her hair, x-rayed her, gave her stitches, and the doctor said if it had gone in 1/8 of an inch further, it would have killed her. As we were in the hospital, there was a man there shouting that he was God. Apparently the police had picked him up walking along High Street in the middle of the traffic. When we got back, all the blood had been cleaned up. Fair play, Michael had cleaned everything. And to tidy it all up, he put everything into a plastic bucket and set it on fire. Mike used to love sport, and in Gendros school his new sport was cricket. When he was about 9, we were in the house one day when he came down after a bath and said, "I've got a lump in my belly." I couldn't believe it. Every time he lifted his hands above his head, this lump would come out by his chest bone at the top of his stomach. The doctor said it was a stomach rupture or a hernia. He went into Morriston Hospital for about 4 days, I think, and when we had him home, he was so proud of his scar. He still is. He's 37 now and showed me quite recently. When we visited Pontypridd, we enjoyed going for walks up Eglwysillin Mountain. All the family would trek up to the top and go for a drink and some crisps in the pub at the top. They used to say that paddling in the mountain stream would stop you ever having arthritis, but I reckon it would bring it on as the water was always so cold. We would go to Barry Island too, and once had the train from Ponty to Barry. This was the first time Michael ever went on a train, and Carol was terrified of falling down the gap between the platform and the train. It was a good walk from the station home to Rydfelin, but we were all used to walking everywhere